The champagne glasses were still ringing with toasts when Odessa Pruitt saw the woman everyone adored slip a small pharmaceutical case into the lining of her handbag, snap it shut, and smile at the next guest as if nothing in the world was wrong. Odessa's hands went cold around the tray she was carrying. 3 weeks later, standing in the middle of a ballroom on Sullivan's Island with 200 of the wealthiest people in Charleston watching, Odessa would be fired, humiliated, and dragged out by security before that same handbag ever hit the floor. And then everything would change. Grayson Colefield was the kind of billionaire people wrote magazine profiles about, not because he wanted the attention, but because his story refused to be ignored. Born in a cramped apartment above a laundromat in Columbia, South Carolina, Grayson grew up watching his mother work double shifts as a hospital orderly while his father drifted between odd jobs and long silences. There was no trust fund waiting for him, no family name that opened doors. What he had was an old library card, a stubborn mind for numbers, and a habit of staying up past midnight teaching himself how circuit boards worked. By 26, he had patented a battery technology that made electric vehicles charge nearly twice as fast. By 34, he had built Colefield Dynamics into one of the most valuable clean energy companies in the country. By 45, his name sat comfortably on lists of the wealthiest self-made men in America, right alongside men who had inherited empires instead of building them one sleepless night at a time. But money never changed the way he treated people, and everyone who worked for him seemed to have their own small story to prove it. He remembered the names of every security guard, every landscaper, every assistant who had ever worked for him, and he asked after their families the way most people only pretend to. He quietly covered a groundskeeper's wife's emergency surgery through his lawyer, asking that his name never be attached to it. He funded a scholarship program for hospital workers' children in Columbia, in his mother's honor, without ever holding a press conference about it. To the business world, he was a visionary chasing the next decade of clean energy. To the people who worked inside his home on Sullivan's Island, he was simply Mr. Colefield, a man who said good morning to everyone by name and actually meant it. His estate, Windermere House, sat on 11 oceanfront acres just outside Charleston, a property of white columns, wraparound porches, and gardens that bloomed year-round thanks to horticulturists Grayson had personally hired away from a botanical garden in Savannah. It was the kind of home that appeared in travel magazines, the kind of place where garden parties turned into local legend told and retold for years afterward. And for the past 9 years, it had been home not just to Grayson, but to his wife, Marlo. Marlo Devereaux had walked into Grayson's life at a charity gala nearly a decade earlier, and by most accounts, she had walked in like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. She was warm in a way that made strangers feel like old friends. She organized toy drives for children's hospitals every winter and personally delivered the gifts herself. At Windermere House, she learned the names of the kitchen workers' children and brought the groundskeepers sweet tea on brutal August afternoons. To the outside world, Marlo and Grayson were the picture of a modern American love story, the self-made billionaire and the compassionate wife who had softened him, humanized him, made the empire feel like a home. Magazine writers loved to call her the heart behind the fortune. Local news segments called their marriage Charleston's greatest love story, complete with soft focus photo spreads of the two of them walking the beach at Windermere House at sunset. Even Grayson's own sister, Bridget Colefield, who had been skeptical of every woman her brother dated before Marlo, had come around completely, telling anyone who would listen that Marlo was the best thing that had ever happened to him, that she had watched her brother laugh more freely in the last 9 years than in the 20 before them combined. Nobody who watched Marlo glide through Windermere House, gracious and radiant, remembering the names of children she'd met only once, ever would have guessed that behind the warmth was a woman quietly counting the months until her husband's mind slipped far enough for her to take everything he had spent a lifetime building. Odessa Pruitt had been cleaning Windermere House for a little over 3 years, ever since a car accident left her unable to keep her old job as a hospital records clerk. She was 38, raising her 12-year-old son, Theo, alone, grateful for steady work and an employer who, unlike most, actually seemed to notice when she was having a hard week. Grayson had once caught Odessa quietly crying in the laundry room after a call from Theo's school about a medical bill for a specialist he needed to see. Without making a scene, Grayson simply told his assistant the following day that the Colefield Family Foundation would be covering Theo's ongoing medical costs going forward, no explanation required. When Odessa tried to thank him, he waved her off gently. "Everybody deserves a chance to breathe easier," he said. "Consider it done, and consider it forgotten." From that day forward, Odessa would have walked through fire for that man, not out of obligation, but out of the kind of loyalty that only grows from being seen when nobody else was looking. Unlike the other household staff, Odessa was quiet by nature, the sort of person who noticed everything and said very little. It was that quiet attention that made her the first person in the entire household to notice that something about Marlowe Colefield had begun to change. Before we go further, if a story about the overlooked people who see the truth first means something to you, consider subscribing to Harbourlight Stories. It helps more than you'd think, and it costs you nothing but a tap. Now, back to Windermere House. It started small, the way these things always do. Grayson, a man who had once memorized the birthdays of every employee at Windermere House without being told, began forgetting simple things. He asked his driver the same question twice within the same short ride into the city. He walked into his study looking for a document he had just set down moments earlier, patting his own pockets in confusion before he found it exactly where he'd left it. During a board meeting for Coalfield Dynamics, an assistant later mentioned nervously to the kitchen staff, Grayson had lost his train of thought mid-sentence and simply stared at the room for nearly 10 seconds before recovering, laughing it off as a long week. At first, everyone assumed exhaustion. Grayson worked relentless hours and had just turned 52, an age where a little forgetfulness felt almost expected, almost forgivable. Even Bridget, visiting for a long weekend, noticed her brother repeat himself twice over dinner and chalked it up to jet lag from a trip he'd taken the week before. But Odessa noticed something the rest of the household didn't, something that had nothing to do with age or exhaustion. Every single time Grayson had one of these strange, foggy episodes, it happened within an hour or two of the evening tea that Marlowe insisted on preparing herself, waving away the household chef whenever he offered, calling it, with a soft laugh, the one thing a wife should still get to do with her own hands. One evening, arriving earlier than expected to wipe down the private kitchen ahead of a dinner party, Odessa saw Marlowe standing at the counter with a small case Odessa had never noticed before, carefully measuring a fine white powder from a glass vial into Grayson's tea using a tiny scale, the kind used for precise pharmaceutical dosing rather than seasoning food. Marlowe startled at the sound of the door, closing the case fast and sliding it into a drawer, her smile arriving a half-second too late to feel natural. "Just a special vitamin blend," she said. "Doctor's orders. Don't worry yourself about it." Odessa apologized for interrupting and backed out of the room immediately, her heart pounding in a way she couldn't quite explain, telling herself all the way down the hallway that rich people took all kinds of strange supplements, that there had to be a harmless explanation, that she was almost certainly imagining more than was really there. She almost believed it, too, until the next morning, when Grayson called his own housekeeper by the wrong name for the second time that week. Over the following weeks, Odessa began noticing things she couldn't unsee. Marlowe took private calls in the locked greenhouse at the far edge of the property, calls that always ended abruptly the moment a staff member's footsteps approached the glass. A private physician, a Dr. Silas Rennick, began visiting under the guise of routine wellness checkups for Grayson, but he never came through the main entrance the way every other doctor who'd ever treated the family had. He came through the side door, the one closest to the private study, always in the early evening, always meeting Marlowe alone first for 20 minutes or more before anyone remembered to mention he was there to see Grayson at all. Odessa learned his name off an appointment card left carelessly on the study desk, and something about it unsettled her the moment she saw it, though she couldn't have said exactly why. Maybe it was the handwriting, small and rushed, the way a person writes when they don't want to be caught writing it. Maybe it was simply the accumulation of everything else she'd already started noticing, the tea, the powder, the locked greenhouse door, all of it beginning to add up to a shape she didn't yet have words for. One rainy evening in late October, passing the study on her way to the linen closet with an armful of towels, Odessa heard Marlowe's voice through the partly open door, sharp and low in a way she'd never heard the woman use in 3 years of working in that house. "It needs to happen before December," Marlowe was saying. "Increase it." A second voice, Rennick's, answered, tense and careful. "That could kill him, Marlowe." There was a pause long enough that Odessa, frozen in the hallway with towels pressed against her chest, wondered if the conversation had ended. Then, colder than anything she had ever heard from the woman everyone in Charleston adored, Marlowe said 4 words that would echo in Odessa's head for weeks afterward. Then don't make a mistake. Odessa didn't hear anything else. Footsteps moved toward the door and she fled down the hallway, not stopping until she reached her car in the staff lot, where she sat behind the wheel for nearly 20 minutes, shaking, replaying for sentences that told her almost nothing and everything at once. She didn't know what it was. She didn't know what was supposed to happen in December, or why it mattered so much that a mistake wasn't allowed. She only knew, with a certainty that settled into her chest like a stone, that whatever Marlowe was doing to her husband was deliberate, and that the woman preparing his tea every night with her own 2 hands was the last person on earth who actually wanted him to get better. The next morning, still running on almost no sleep, Odessa approached the estate's head of security, Walt Granger, a retired police officer who had worked for the Colefield family for over a decade and had always struck her as a fair man, someone who at least listened before deciding what to do with what he heard. She found him in the small security office off the garage and explained, as calmly as her shaking voice allowed, what she'd overheard through the study door the night before. Walt sat back in his chair and looked at her with something close to pity, the particular expression of a man who believes the person in front of him is sincere and still thinks she's wrong. "Odessa, I hear you," he said carefully. "But you understand what you're accusing here, right? Mrs. Colefield runs 3 different charities. She's on the board of the Children's Hospital. You're telling me you think she's poisoning her husband based on 4 sentences through a door?" He shook his head slowly, not unkindly, which somehow made it harder to argue with. "I can't take that upstairs without something real. If I go to Mr. Colefield's lawyers with a story like that and I'm wrong, it's my job on the line. Might be yours too." Odessa tried Bridget next, catching her during one of her visits to the estate, choosing her words as carefully as she could manage. Bridget listened all the way through without interrupting, her expression tightening with discomfort rather than alarm as Odessa finished. "I love my brother," she said finally, not unkindly, "but I can't go to war with his wife over a feeling, Odessa. I need something I can actually show someone. Documents. Proof. Something that isn't just a conversation you overheard through a door." Then, meaning only to be fair, meaning only to give Marlowe the chance to explain away what surely had to be a misunderstanding, Bridget made a mistake that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Later that same week, over lunch with Marlowe on the sunroom terrace, she mentioned it gently, almost as an aside, the way you'd bring up something too small to really matter. "One of the cleaning staff has some concerns about your tea routine, of all things." I told her I was sure it was nothing, but I thought you'd want to know. Bridget thought she was smoothing things over, giving her sister-in-law a fair chance to laugh it off before it became anything larger. She had no idea she had just handed the one person in that house capable of real cruelty the exact name of the woman who was watching her. 2 days later, Marlowe found Odessa alone in the laundry room, the same room where Grayson had once found her crying over Theo's medical bill. Marlowe smiled the same warm smile she gave every guest at every gala. "Theo's specialist is expensive, isn't he?" she said, folding a linen napkin with unhurried hands. "Grayson has always been so generous with staff. It would be a shame if something happened to shake his confidence in who deserves that kind of generosity." She set the napkin down, still smiling. "You've always been very observant, Odessa. I hope you're being careful with what you think you've observed." She left without waiting for a response. She didn't need one. Odessa didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table long after Theo had gone to bed, staring at nothing, terrified that one wrong move would cost her son the only medical security he had. She had almost convinced herself to let it go, to keep her head down, finish her shifts, collect her paycheck, and pretend she had never heard anything through that study door. Then Theo wandered out for a glass of water and found her sitting in the dark. "Mom? You okay?" He sat down across from her, 12 years old and still young enough to ask questions without knowing how heavy they'd land. "Isn't Mr. Colefield the man who helped me? With my doctor?" "Yeah, baby. That's him." Theo frowned, thinking it over the way kids do, plainly, without any of the complicated fear adults carry. "Then who's helping him?" Odessa didn't have an answer that night. But she never let go of the question again. Odessa began building a case in secret, terrified now in a way she hadn't been before Marlowe's warning, aware that every extra minute she spent lingering in a room could be the minute someone noticed. She photographed the measuring case whenever she found the private kitchen empty, always careful to leave it exactly as she'd found it, angled the same way, the drawer pushed in the same distance. She found a torn shipping label in the trash bin one evening, a corner of it still legible enough to read a compounding pharmacist's name out of Atlanta, and on her one day off that month, she drove 3.5 hours to ask about it in person, presenting herself as a home health aide trying to confirm an order for her employer's ongoing care. The pharmacist wouldn't share prescription details, standard privacy protocol, but mentioned, trying to be helpful, that the account was billed through a private LLC rather than an individual. Odessa looked up the filing on her phone in the parking lot before she'd even pulled out of the space. The registered agent was Silas Rennick. She kept everything in a small spiral notebook, hidden beneath the spare tire in the trunk of her car, dates and times and small unexplainable details written in handwriting that got messier the more her hand shook. One Tuesday morning, going out to add a new entry before her shift, she found the notebook exactly where she'd left it, tucked against the wheel well beneath a folded blanket. Except it wasn't quite the same. A corner of one page, damp from an earlier rain that had leaked briefly into the trunk, had dried into a slightly different fold than she remembered leaving it, the crease running the wrong direction. She told herself she was imagining it. She told herself that twice more over the following week before she finally stopped believing her own reassurance. 3 days after that, passing Odessa in the east hallway on her way to a lunch appointment, Marlowe slowed just long enough to say, without ever quite looking directly at her, "You've always been very observant, Odessa," and kept walking without waiting for a reply. It was the second time she'd said almost exactly those words. The first time, in the laundry room, it had landed like a warning wrapped in a compliment. This time, delivered so casually, so lightly, in a hallway with nobody else around to hear it, it didn't sound like a warning at all anymore. It sounded like a woman who already knew everything she needed to know, and was simply deciding when to act on it. The morning of the Colefields' 9th anniversary gala, Odessa arrived at Windermere House to find her badge already deactivated at the staff entrance, the little red light blinking uselessly against the card reader no matter how many times she tried it. Walt Granger met her at the gate himself, which told her immediately how serious this was, unable to meet her eyes for more than a second at a time. "I'm sorry, Odessa. Mrs. Colefield says there's evidence you've been taking unauthorized photographs inside the house. She's calling it theft of proprietary information. I've got orders to escort you off the property, effective immediately, and I've got orders to make sure you don't come back tonight." He paused, shifting his weight, a man who had spent 20 years enforcing rules he clearly didn't feel good about enforcing today. "For what it's worth, I don't like this. But it's not my call to make." Odessa didn't fight it. There was nothing to fight with. The notebook, the photographs, the pharmacy paperwork, all of it sat uselessly in her own possession now, evidence of a crime nobody with real power had ever been willing to look at, stripped of the one thing that had let her move through that house in the first place, a badge, a uniform, a reason to be believed simply enough to be standing in the right room at the right moment. She sat in her car outside the gates of Windermere House for a long time, watching caterers and florists and string quartet musicians stream past her toward a party she was no longer allowed to attend, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she let herself believe it might actually be over. Marlowe had won. Grayson was going to drink whatever was waiting for him in that tea tonight, in front of 200 witnesses who would only see confirmation of a decline everyone already believed was tragic but natural, and there was nothing left Odessa could do about it from a car parked on the wrong side of a locked gate. She thought about driving home. She thought about Theo, waiting for her, probably already at the kitchen table with his homework spread out, probably already planning to ask her how her day went, the way he always did, expecting an ordinary answer. Then she thought of his question from 3 weeks earlier, the one she still didn't have a real answer for. Then who's helping him? She started the car, not toward home, but toward a florist supply warehouse 40 minutes inland, where an old coworker from her hospital records days still owed her a favor big enough to matter. She came back through the service gate 2 hours later wearing a caterer's black uniform borrowed from her coworker, a size too large, the sleeves rolled twice at the wrist, carrying a crate of centerpiece flowers nobody looked at twice. Getting past the gate was the easy part. Delivery vans came and went all evening, and one more tired-looking woman in black carrying flowers didn't draw a second glance from anyone checking clipboards. Getting close to Grayson was not going to be so easy. She moved through the edges of the party the way she'd spent 3 years learning to move through rooms full of people who didn't notice her, setting the crate down near the florist's staging table and slipping into the crowd, scanning the lawn and the terrace for a face she'd know instantly no matter how many guests stood between them. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She kept thinking about Walt Granger's face at the gate that morning, about Marlowe's voice in the laundry room, about what would happen to Theo's medical coverage if this went as badly as every rational part of her brain insisted it would. She kept walking anyway. She found Marlowe near the dessert table shortly after sunset, exactly where the tea ritual always led on nights like this, a delicate porcelain teacup already in hand, moving unhurried and radiant toward a small circle that included Grayson and 2 of his board members, the string quartet still playing softly behind her like nothing in the world was about to go wrong. Odessa set down the crate she'd carried this far and stepped directly into Marlowe's path, her heart slamming so hard she was certain everyone within 10 feet could hear it. "Mrs. Colefield," she said, her voice shaking but loud enough to turn heads, "everyone needs to know what's really in your husband's tea." The reaction was instant, and it was not the reaction Odessa had hoped for. A ripple of confused laughter moved through the nearest guests. Marlowe's face arranged itself into something between pity and alarm. "Oh, Odessa!" She turned to the small crowd gathering around them, her voice pitched perfectly for an audience. "This woman was fired this morning for stealing private photographs from this house. I didn't want to say anything publicly, but since she's forced my hand, I believe she's been trying to extort my husband's family for months." She looked back at Odessa, almost gently, almost sorrowfully. "I'm so sorry it's come to this. Someone please call security." It worked exactly as Marlowe intended it to. Guests who moments earlier had been sipping champagne and admiring the string lights now stared at Odessa with the particular blend of discomfort and suspicion reserved for a stranger accused of a crime in a room full of people who trust the accuser completely and automatically. Someone murmured that they'd always thought that woman looked familiar. Someone else asked, not quietly enough, whether the caterers even ran background checks anymore. 2 security guards began moving toward her from opposite ends of the terrace, closing the distance fast. Grayson himself looked at her with confusion rather than recognition, the fog Marlowe had spent months carefully building sitting heavy and undeniable behind his eyes, and for one terrible second Odessa watched the one person she'd risked everything to save look straight through her as though she were exactly as invisible as everyone had always assumed she was. She had one more sentence left in her, and she used it. "The vials," she said, louder now, past caring how it sounded, pointing at the handbag still hanging from Marlowe's shoulder. "Look inside her bag. Please. Just look." A guard reached for her arm. Marlowe, already half turned toward the small crowd to accept their sympathy, laughed softly, almost sadly, the exact performance of a woman being unfairly wronged. "I think that's quite enough," she said, and reached out with her free hand to wave the guard forward, the teacup still balanced in her other palm. That was the moment the strap slid off her shoulder. It happened the way small disasters always seem to in hindsight, too fast to stop and too slow, somehow, to miss. Marlowe's hand jerked instinctively to catch the bag before it hit the ground, the teacup tipping, hot liquid splashing across her own wrist, and in the half-second of pain and surprise that followed, her grip on the bag's strap wrenched sideways instead of steadying it. The clasp gave way. The bag hit the marble terrace and spilled open. A small navy passport skidded out first, its cover cracked with use, sliding to a stop directly at Bridget's feet. Beside it landed the pharmaceutical case, popping open on impact, 3 glass vials rolling across the stone in front of 30 stunned guests who, moments earlier, had been ready to watch Odessa Pruitt hauled off in handcuffs. The string quartet trailed into silence mid-phrase, one violin note hanging in the air a beat longer than the others before it, too, went quiet. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the guard who had a hand around Odessa's arm simply let it fall away, forgotten. Bridget knelt slowly and picked up the passport, her expensive gown pooling around her on the marble as though none of that mattered anymore. She stared at the photograph inside it for a long moment, Marlowe's own face looking back up at her under a name sheet. Never once heard in 9 years of holidays and birthdays and long afternoons on this very terrace. When she finally spoke, her voice came out barely above a whisper, the voice of someone still hoping, against everything in front of her, for an explanation that made this make sense. Marlowe. Why does this say Marlowe Ashworth? Grayson turned. Whatever fog had clouded him only seconds earlier seemed, for just this moment, to burn away entirely, replaced by something far worse, total, devastating clarity. He looked at the vials scattered across the stone. He looked at the passport trembling slightly in his sister's hands. He looked, finally, at his wife of 9 years, the woman who had held his hand through board meetings and hospital waiting rooms and every ordinary Tuesday in between, and he asked the only question that mattered anymore. Was any of it real? He didn't shout it. He barely raised his voice above the level he'd have used to ask her to pass the salt, and somehow that made it worse, made every guest on that terrace go stiller than they already were. Marlowe opened her mouth once, and closed it again. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't confirm what the silence already had confirmed for her. 9 years, Grayson said, quiet and level, each word landing like something being set down carefully so it wouldn't break further than it already had. I thought you were protecting me. You were only ever protecting the day you could own me. He didn't look away from her as he spoke to the guard still standing near Odessa, waiting for orders that no longer made any sense to give. Let her go, he said. Get my wife off my property instead. What followed moved quickly once real investigators, rather than a frightened household, were finally looking. Toxicology confirmed a sedative compound in Grayson's system, administered in small escalating doses for the better part of a year, precisely enough to produce fog and confusion without ever triggering the kind of medical emergency that might have brought outside doctors in sooner. Financial records tied the passport to an offshore account registered under the name Marlowe Ashworth, funded through inflated vendor invoices she had quietly approved through her limited authority over the household's accounts. Text messages between Marlowe and Dr. Silas Rennick, recovered from his phone once his medical license was suspended pending investigation, laid out the plan in language no jury needed explained twice, a competency evaluation time to land before the December board vote, guardianship transferring control of Colefield Dynamics to Marlowe the moment the paperwork cleared, and a $2 million payment to Rennick once it was done. Both were arrested within 2 weeks. Both were convicted the following spring in a Charleston County courtroom packed with reporters, Marlowe sentenced to 18 years, Rennick to 12. On the witness stand, Bridget testified through tears about the afternoon she'd mentioned Odessa's concerns to Marlowe directly, never imagining for a moment that a passing remark meant only to smooth over a misunderstanding could put anyone in real danger. I made her prove she deserved to be heard, Bridget told the courtroom, her voice breaking, instead of just listening the first time she tried to tell me. Later, outside the courthouse steps, she found Odessa waiting near her car and said it to her again, quietly, just the two of them, away from the cameras. You tried to save my brother, and I made you prove it first, at your own expense, more than once. I'm sorry doesn't cover that. I don't think anything does. But I'm saying it anyway, for as long as you'll let me. Within a month of the medication stopping, under the care of a neurologist Bridget personally vetted through a hospital far from anyone Marlowe had ever touched, Grayson's memory sharpened noticeably, week by week, the fog that had settled over him for the better part of a year finally beginning to lift. He walked back into the boardroom of Colefield Dynamics that December, not as a man being quietly evaluated for incompetence, but as the same sharp, deliberate leader who had built the company out of nothing, and the room stood and applauded before he'd even reached his chair. But the moment that mattered most to him didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened in the kitchen at Windermere House, the same small room off the master suite where Marlowe had once measured out doses into his tea with a scale meant for something else entirely. Grayson had it gutted and rebuilt within weeks of the trial starting, new cabinets, new counters, as though the room itself needed somewhere to put what had happened there. He asked Odessa to meet him there, not in the formal receiving room where he greeted business associates, and when she arrived, he didn't stand on ceremony. "I built a company by trusting my instincts about people," he told her, sitting across a small table from the woman who had spent 3 years cleaning his floors without him ever fully understanding how closely she'd been watching, in the best possible sense of that word. "And I got the most important decision of my life wrong for 9 years, while the person who actually saw the truth was someone I walked past every single day without really seeing at all." Odessa shook her head, uncomfortable as always with too much attention pointed her way. "I almost stopped," she admitted quietly. "She found me in the laundry room and told me, without ever quite saying it, that my son's medical support depended on me keeping my mouth shut. I sat at my own kitchen table for hours trying to decide if any of this was worth that risk." She paused, turning her coffee cup slowly on the table without drinking from it. "My son asked me who was helping you. I didn't have an answer that night. I think that's the only reason I kept going. I couldn't live with not having one." Grayson slid a folder across the table toward her. Inside was full university funding for Theo, wherever he chose to go, along with a deed to a modest home near the coast, paid in full, in Odessa's name alone, nothing tied to her continued employment, nothing that could ever again be threatened by someone standing in a laundry room folding napkins. "This isn't a reward," he said. "A reward would insult what you actually did. This is just me trying, in some small way, to give your son the kind of security you gave me by refusing to stay quiet." That evening, Odessa came home and found Theo at the kitchen table doing homework, same as always. She set the folder down without opening it again and sat across from him. "Did Mr. Colefield get better?" he asked, not looking up from his math. "Yeah, baby. He's going to be okay." Theo smiled, satisfied, and went back to his homework, already moving on to whatever came next in a 12-year-old's evening. Odessa sat there a moment longer than she needed to, watching him, and found herself crying quietly at her own kitchen table, not because of the folder, not because of the house, but because the man who had once quietly made sure her son could see a doctor was alive tonight only because she had refused to let him go. Grayson later established a program through the Colefield Family Foundation to support household workers and caregivers who report abuse or exploitation, giving them a way to be heard that didn't depend on someone else deciding they'd earned the right to speak. He named it after her, though Odessa asked him twice not to. He did it anyway. If this story stayed with you, take a second to like it. Tell us in the comments whether you believe the people who notice the most are usually the ones nobody thinks to ask, and subscribe to Harborlight Stories for more. Sometimes the people who save us are not the ones with the most power in the room. They are the ones who were paying attention while everyone else was too dazzled to look closely. Odessa Pruitt lost her job, her credibility, and nearly her son's security trying to save a man everyone else had already stopped questioning. She got them all back, but that was never why she did it. She did it because somebody had to be the one who didn't look away, and on that night, in that house, she was the only one left willing to be her.